Coming up next. Stay tuned to learn more about the state of blockchain education at major universities all around the world. Reimagine 2020.
I'm Warren Anderson, head of developer relations at Ripple. Excited to be at Reimagine 2020.
Hey everybody, you got Patrick McLain here, one of your hosts for Reimagine 2020. Excited, we have Warren Paul Anderson here, guest from Ripple. Obviously, anybody in blockchain has pretty much heard of Ripple, one of the bigger names. So very excited to get their perspective. Warren works on developer relations, and obviously a lot of colleges, a lot of interested developers, kind of the new generation of blockchain watching this talk. So I think there's definitely some interesting insights that he's going to be able to provide. But before I butcher it, Warren, I'll let you introduce yourself and maybe tell the audience, what you do at Ripple and why you're excited to be in blockchain.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for having me. Excited to be here. So I've been at Ripple for about 4 years. Been in the crypto space kind of more broadly since about 2012. I primarily worked on the product side of Ripple, building out the XRP Ledger core protocol, working with third-party developers to build out the open source software. Also built out the on-demand liquidity product, which is one of Ripple's flagship products for cross-border payments in RippleNet. And then recently joined the Xspring team about a year ago to kind of focus on building out this open platform for money, and kicked off the developer relations function to engage developers more globally earlier this year. So been pretty busy.
Yeah. First off, you're in San Francisco, yeah?
Yep, Bay Area, yep.
Well, so, we were just talking before the call, I've spent some time there and I'm always intrigued. You kind of have this Silicon Valley environment, right, where there's startups and VCs, right? And that's kind of been like one of the hearts of tech, and I think to a certain extent, blockchain's like this new up and coming, like a lot of the Silicon Valley elite don't really know if it's real or not. What's kind of the reception that you see in the Bay Area and kind of that old guard to a certain extent, and how are they viewing blockchain?
It's an interesting question. So I actually moved to the Bay Area in 2014. I started a Bitcoin company in 2013 in Boston. And at the time, Bitcoin was still there were a lot of question marks around, its legitimacy, particularly in Boston, which is historically a more kind of traditional kind of enterprise software tech kind of scene. So I moved here in 2014, and immediately we pitched a few investors and picked up seed funding from Tim Draper and Mark Benioff, who are like super big believers in Bitcoin and cryptocurrency more broadly. And this was the beginning of the what we now know as smart contracts. So it's been interesting to see kind of the evolution of blockchain over the course of the last 6 years. I definitely think that even though the Bay Area is a kind of a melting pot for technology like blockchain, it's by no means restricted to the Bay Area. So Ripple, for instance, has offices in 9 different countries. And we are constantly seeing kind of more and more adoption, outside of the Bay Area and outside of the US. And actually, we think that that's actually helping to drive, innovation within the US, because areas like Southeast Asia are really picking up the technology very quickly and are pushing kind of the boundaries of what can be built.
Got it. Yeah, and I would agree. I think we're seeing that more and more. I think in a lot of technologies we find first adopters in I don't know, you call them the top economic countries or first world countries, but it's almost, I think there's opportunity for reverse in blockchain, right? Where a lot of the countries that will pick it up quickly are not going to be, quote unquote, the most advanced or first world countries, right? And I think their belief systems or the way they've interacted. You know, I lived in East Africa for many years, right? And in a decade ago, where they're using M-Pesa from their cell phones, right? And nobody liked banks. So these technologies are kind of they've already been preparing for them to a certain extent. And that dichotomy to me is very interesting. The next question I was going to ask, when you talk about Xspring, you know, I know a lot of people, I think in blockchain kind of understand core Ripple, but, you know, for those that don't really understand Xspring yet, or haven't, you know, hasn't been put on their radar, where does that kind of differ from Ripple's core initiatives, or does it differ? And why is that a, you know, kind of standalone initiative?
Yeah, that's a good question. So people mispronounce it. Xspring is just spring, like a water or like the season. I get it all the time. I've heard worse. So Spring is basically was originally kicked off in 2018 as the venture arm for Ripple, and then as we were making, we actually deployed about $500 million across 25 companies. And as we're working with startups, you know, we started realizing that, you know, startups need more than just capital. They need tools, they need services to actually be successful as entrepreneurs and creators. So we started building out an open platform, developer platform for money. More, it's kind of what the tagline is. But really what that means is that Spring is building on, you know, open standards, open source software, open networks. We're providing, you know, tools, we're providing services, you know, we're contributing to protocols, and we have, you know, actual programs that make, you know, help make developers successful every day. And where that kind of compares to Ripple, kind of the business more broadly, you know, Ripple is primarily, you know, focused on something called RippleNet, which is an enterprise payment network for financial institutions to particularly do cross-border payments. So, you know, many years ago, Ripple kind of sought out to kind of reduce the friction in payments in the cross-border sense, because they saw that that was the most expensive and the most, you know, costly in terms of time, kind of so the lowest hanging fruit. And so RippleNet was created, and Spring's kind of building out an open kind of platform for particularly for developers to be able to even build their own Ripple nets, right? Where we think that, you know, it would be great for the economy and the global economy to see more, you know, more networks that interoperate with each other, and less friction between these different borders.
Got it. And as I think you mentioned, you know, Spring, not Xspring. Everybody, not let me make that mistake. That should be the last time. It sounds like that kind of came, if I'm not mistaken, from an investment capital arm. That's where it started. So to kind of come to where it is today, and it sounds like, so I guess I'm curious, what was that evolution from being the investment side to then being something where, you know, you kind of make tools or things easily deployable or built, you know, things to be built more quickly for developers? Was that kind of an evolution out of necessity to say, to deploy this capital, we're kind of realizing that people need the tools to build these things more quickly so that we can deploy this capital?
A little bit, you know, it's kind of ironic where, you know, we deployed, you know, $500 million in capital, and we actually realized there's a lot of friction in just deploying capital. You know, and we're, you know, our Ripple's DNA is in payments and core blockchain, and open source software. And here we were sitting on all this like amazing technology, and yet, you know, it wasn't really, we couldn't really use it to actually deploy our own capital. So we started building out the tools kind of and filling some of the gaps necessary to be able to deploy that capital easier. So breaking it down from, you know, how do developers get paid every day? You know, what are the core, you know, components that they need to get paid? How do we make those better? How do we get developers paid faster, cheaper? You know, really rewarding the creators kind of directly. So once we started kind of thinking about that, we started breaking down the problems into the kind of core components, and then starting to kind of see how we can actually build out those core components. So that's where we are now, you know, where we're basically sitting on top of all this open source technology. You know, Spring team is about 90% engineering. So we have about 45 to 50 developers. that work on open source software full time. So a lot of people have said, oh, Ripple's kind of, or Spring's kind of like the open source team at Ripple. And I think it's actually a pretty good analogy.
Got it. Well, yeah, and again, for, I think any of the university students, really watching here, that want to become part of open source communities or contribute and really, find tool sets that make their development times faster and less friction. I think it's definitely something that they should check out. So I have a question about Spring and how you guys are thinking about it. How are you guys measuring success?
That's a good question. So, just like most Silicon Valley startups, we use the objectives and key results, kind of OKRs. And really kind of what we measure is, and more broadly, kind of how Ripple kind of measures success is based on liquidity. Now that's a big kind of loaded term. But really what that means is, how easy is it for any, type of entity to be able to access, money in order to get their payments, from A to B. And we see a lot of opportunity to introduce, better ways to actually for promoting more liquidity, within these payment networks. So that's really kind of what we wake up every day, thinking about is how do we build liquidity in different markets where, cross-border payments particularly are, a big flow. You're in, Thailand, and, Thailand does a tremendous amount, I think over, $1 billion in remittance.
I saw CM Bank, you guys just signed a deal in Thailand for doing remittance and with Ripple actually like a day or two ago.
Yeah, and in places like, Southeast Asia, it's particularly interesting. In fact, that's probably the hottest region that Ripple has the most customers, because you have this region that's like relatively small geographically, but you have so many different countries and no one uses a common currency. So you have all that friction kind of sending payments, kind of back and forth. You can probably actually see it on the map here.
Got it.
So yeah, so that's kind of what we really wake up, about, thinking about every day. And this is like liquidity is, there's no panacea. There's no like all-in-one solution to solve liquidity challenges. Most of Wall Street's thinking about how to solve, liquidity challenges every day. We're just doing it in a more kind of like programmatic, kind of engineering focused kind of way.
Got it. Kind of staying on that topic, when we think about different countries, what are you guys seeing, geographically? Obviously, and like you mentioned, Thailand has one of the most advanced, digital transaction banking systems, right? It works really well. I think we could detract why that anomaly happened, but where are you guys seeing unique friction in the U.S. compared to Asia, compared to Africa, Latin America? And how do you guys kind of juggle that litigation or legislation?
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. So the irony is, I travel a lot, kind of globally, and I'm always really kind of a little disappointed every time I come back to the U.S. To see, how slow payments are. I mean, just processing, just paying, basic kind of bills or paying, mortgage or anything. It takes days for, checks to clear and settle. Whereas you go to a place like, like Thailand or Mexico, where, payments can actually settle and clear in a matter of seconds. So I think the US has a lot of work to do to kind of catch up to the rest of the world in terms of like reducing friction for just basic domestic payments. But that's kind of why Ripple kind of focused on solving the cross-border payment kind of problems first, because that was like the lowest hanging fruit and the most friction. Whereas, some of these domestic payment networks are still kind of figuring out how to, how to kind of become more reliable, more efficient, and obviously more liquid.
So would you say, from what you've seen, are governments becoming more open to it, or are you guys running into more friction and kind of in different borders? Are you finding more governments are coming online and saying, we want this, we want to deploy this technology, we are, really open to it, or do you see that there's other third parties, private interests that are kind of standing in the way?
Yeah. So, one thing that kind of attracted me, about Ripple 4 years ago was, Ripple has always been very, pro kind of regulation, where, Ripple always wants to work with regulators, worldwide. And we have a whole regulatory affairs team, that works with regulators all over the world, in different regions. And, they report back all the time. Conversations are getting, interestingly enough, more technical. So, regulators where, 5 years ago, it was, what is blockchain? Now they're asking about the nuances of like proof of stake versus, proof of work, and how different consensus mechanisms compare. So it's actually been, I've always been really impressed with how sharp regulators are. And, they've really got a tough job. They want to kind of minimize downside risk, and then make sure the upside is fair for everyone. So, that's always been a challenge. And I think, though, that, there's been sensible frameworks that have been passed in different countries, and those countries are kind of serving as the leaders. And there's a lot of great success cases that are coming out of that, where you're seeing like successful businesses being built. You're seeing, cheaper payments where, if it's a country that receives a lot of remittance, that's more money to actual citizens, which is really important. So, I think there's huge advantages for governments to get ahead of the regulatory kind of frameworks and start to paint a super clear path for developers and entrepreneurs to actually build businesses.
Got it. So I think if we step outside for 1 second and we don't look at the governments, but let's say we take, enterprise companies, banks, et cetera. I would say it appears to me from the outside that if I were to pick probably any company in blockchain who has, gone and try to shake hands or do as many deals, probably at the scale and size, needed to kind of push this forward or really prove the blockchain use case. I kind of think of Ripple in the top, of that list. So I'm just curious, what are some of the hurdles that you think are kind of stopping adoption in the private sector? Is it fear that you're going to replace them in certain aspects, or do they not understand the benefits? Do they understand the benefits, but they don't want to deploy, the resources to kind of make it happen? Or is everybody jumping on board every day and your inbox is full and you don't have enough time to stop adding new users?
Yeah, in terms of like private sector adoption, I really think that the biggest hurdle has been the lack of, regulatory clarity in some markets. We are seeing that change. It's a lot better than it was, 4 or 5 years ago. We're starting to see, regulators lean in on this technology, realizing that, hey, this is actually transformational in a good way and can be really positive for individual citizens and businesses alike. So the more kind of clarity there is, the better and faster entrepreneurs and developers can actually, work and build more technology to help, everyday consumers or businesses kind of, reduce that whole friction where when it comes to, at the end of the day, when it comes to liquidity, where you need access to capital in order to do things.
Totally. And I think you're right. I think you can look at countries that provided, regulatory frameworks, sandboxing environments, right? That where I think innovation was a bit more welcome versus, countries that had kind of left it very ambiguous, right? So people were literally scared to take steps, whether or not what they were doing in the moment was clear. It might even be what came back to them 2 years later about something they did, right? And I think, at least to me, it's fairly unique to see something at this scale that, lack of clarity can dissuade or promote technologies or innovation, right? So Kind of on that topic, I think when I look at, what happened around October, November, with kind of the announcement of Libra shortly before that, and kind of Zuckerberg getting hauled in front of Congress, how did you guys kind of view that? I mean, was that kind of a shot to you guys? Like, were they taking the bullet for you guys? Like, they're the ones sitting there instead of you guys, and so you're cheering it on, or what were your guys' thoughts about that?
Yeah, I know, like Brad, our CEO, has kind of come out, and what the interesting thing is, when Libra announced the project, it was really just a white paper. We know better than most, like, how hard it is to take a network from, a white paper to an actual, production network. In fact, the creators of the XRP Ledger actually didn't even post a white paper until the network was live for about 2 years. So the practicality of actually launching a network, getting it live, building out, the robustness of, like, security and reliability and performance, that's a long, tail of a project. So the initial announcement was, kind of interesting. It was like a pretty quick read on the white paper. I think it was also kind of a demonstration of a little bit of, like, what not to do when it comes to, working with regulatory, organizations. I think Ripple always takes the stance to, like, engage regulators early and often, so that, when there is a headline, regulators, it's old news for them. They've already, heard about it. They already know about it. When they get, people to ask about it, they're well informed and they can talk about it. I think Libra was like the opposite. These regulators were reading about Libra for the first time in a press release. That's not how they want to learn about this stuff. I think it did shed some pretty good light, I think, on Ripple. I think, Brad has said before, it did quite a good amount of work on our kind of customer development. I think more people started engaging a little deeper with us, because they understood that, we've actually done a lot of work to actually make a production network, live and starting to scale it. And we're way beyond years, almost a decade beyond the actual white paper kind of phase.
Got it. No, and I think that makes sense. I've companies we've invested in, or I've seen it from the Ubers and the Lyfts of the world, right? Where maybe Uber would go into markets when they were in their high growth phase, and not really, they would just do whatever they wanted and ask for permission later, right? And kind of see the backsplash there. Even seeing it with e-scooters, you saw like Bird and Lime, and you wake up one day in San Francisco, you have these scooters everywhere. And company we were working with, Layer, but they owned a company called Spin. They ended up selling it to Ford, but I always watched their strategy, and they kind of took the opposite approach. Like, they were very heavy to go into regulators to kind of get ahead of the problem, right? And I think putting that time in up front pays dividends later, right? It might not always seem obvious at first, but I will say one thing about you guys. I think you have years of kind of that groundwork being laid. I guess to kind of stay on that a little bit, when you, is it safe to say, like, up until now, your guys' primary customers or target has been like banks, or primarily in fintech?
Yeah, so I think broadly financial institutions. So we kind of divide up the world really into three kind of parts. You have the banks, kind of the traditional, both kind of global and regional, smaller regional banks. And then you have what you call the non-bank financial institutions. So these are payment companies like MoneyGram, that are actually really kind of tech forward. They have been, a lot of them have been, serving mobile apps through, for, years. They use modern APIs, pretty good, solid data structures that can be used to actually build, more applications. And then we have, Spring kind of focuses more on kind of the open developers that may be, it might be, a game developer, it might be a content publisher. It could be, a classic kind of payment kind of application developer. But that's kind of the three different segments of the world. But what we're seeing kind of a lot of growth is actually in the non-bank financial institutions, so the payment companies. You see these payment companies that have,
And these would be like their applications primarily like remittance. I mean, if you put a
yeah. So like classically, Ripple Net kind of serves the remittance market. So, MoneyGram is a classic example of that. MoneyGram's using the product, one of the products I built called On-Demand Liquidity, which actually uses XRP to help facilitate the cross-border payment. So you have, a fiat transaction into XRP, the XRP is sent to a destination exchange, and then another fiat transaction on the back end. And they're seeing huge growth of that product in their own internal system, just because it's like cheaper, faster, and more efficient, and it helps them kind of bring back some of that capital that's trapped in these foreign countries, classically called like Nostro Vostro accounts. So we're seeing like those payment companies actually adopt this technology really, really fast because they see it as a way to reduce their kind of capital kind of expenditures with regard to like parking money all over the world. And it's a great way for them to actually compete with some of the more banking kind of financial institutions that payments is just a sliver of their stack, where these companies are actually focusing on it and it's in their DNA.
Got it. So I think one more question on this, and then I would like to talk to you a bit about, maybe some advice for, university students watching this and how you would approach blockchain if you were kind of coming up in today at university. But, how does Ripple kind of view competitors in the space? Obviously you guys, one of your original founders kind of split is running Stellar. I deal with them a bit. I see some similarities in payment rails and remittance, et cetera. How do you guys kind of view competitors in the space? Like, who are your competitors? How are you guys really diversifying? What's your, or, how do you guys look at the 5-year strategy and how are you going to maintain your competitive advantage?
Yeah, I mean, I think any market that has healthy competitions is a good market. I think it's extremely bad sign if you're in a market where you have no competitors. That might mean you don't have a market. So you alluded to kind of Stellar's great technology, very similar to XRP Ledger. Jed McCaleb, forked it several years ago. And so, classically from a technology kind of standpoint, the networks are similar. There are differences, primarily in like the consensus mechanism that's used, some of the speed and efficiency of the networks. But, I think competitors are super healthy. It depends on how you look kind of at Ripple. In a lot of ways, Ripple can be kind of like the elephant in a dark room where, one person says, oh, I've got the tail. One person says I got the leg, and they're not really sure what it is. But that's just because, we're in this new space. We're still kind of building out kind of early days. Brad, our CEO, always says, we're in a marathon. We're kind of like in the first mile of a marathon. So we've got a long way to go. And we're really kind of thinking, Ripple is as like a multi-generational company where, it's, we're building for the next decade or more. So in order to do that, we also have to look at, what the traditional financial kind of market looks like. What are the companies that are focused on, particularly on cross-border payments, but not just that, but like other kind of verticals that where money, particularly, payments is like, there's a lot of friction. So I think you could kind of start to kind of cut and see like where things would sit there, but.
Got it. And then I guess with Ripple, and we have about 10 minutes here, but with Ripple, I mean, obviously we know like there's going to be a lot of people in blockchain watching this conversation, right? And it's like, yeah, it's still a fractional percentage of the world that actually gets blockchain. But like inside of that community, there's a lot of like opinions, there's a lot of thoughts. It's very cliquey. I think it's very, yeah. You have the libertarians, you have the people that only care about decentralization, et cetera, et cetera. What's your view, or I guess either your view personally or kind of company stance in like, how does Ripple kind of fit in there, right? And if we're being honest, right, like whether it's valid or not, some people in the blockchain, like the true believers of like no centralization, Ripple might get a little flack sometimes, whether that's warranted or not. I think you guys are building a different product, but what's your view? Like, how do you guys kind of fit into the space? How would you like to be viewed in the space? Do you think you're proponents of blockchain? Whether or not people might agree or disagree with you, and I guess we'd just like to hear your thoughts there.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of interesting because I've been in the space for a while, and built out, I was an early Bitcoiner, built out a Bitcoin startup, back in 2013. And so when I joined Ripple in 2016, I was like very aware of, some of the, its reputation in the kind of the smaller Bitcoin community. And I think that, Ripple in a lot of ways is very contrarian. So it was one of the first companies to actually, work with this kind of technology. The creators of the XRP ledger are also, the founders of Ripple, which are very two different distinct, things. So when, people say that, Ripple is centralized, well, Ripple's a company. So there is a company, a centralized company that has 9 global offices, but, there's the XRP ledger, which is, actually, quite decentralized, no matter how you actually, measure decentralization. So there's kind of a lot of, again, it kind of goes back to that, like the elephant in the dark room, you're not really sure, what part of the elephant you have, because there's so many pieces. And that's just, due to the complexity of the technology. But I think Ripple is kind of, one of the few companies in the blockchain crypto space that is kind of reaching a more mainstream audience through its partners and through its customers. So, you have a company like MoneyGram that's using blockchain in their production application. I think a couple months ago, we announced that I think it was a significant percentage of money flow from US to Mexico occurred through the on-demand liquidity product. So US Mexico is one of the largest remittance corridors in the world. And, Ripple was seeing upwards of 10% of that flow actually going through, our production network. So I can't think of another company that can stand up and say that with any degree of confidence. So there's a lot that's kind of going on, I think, on the production side. We're really interested in broadening kind of the scope of the reach in terms of the more mainstream audience, and making sure that our partners and customers are using that technology to kind of reduce that friction for kind of more and more people.
So I guess question was, do you think that enterprise or institutional adoption will lead to greater mass adoption, or do you think that mass adoption will lead to enterprise or institutional adoption?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. So I've always explained to people, like, most financial markets in history have evolved institution first, institution like OTC, over the counter kind of first, which has allowed, time for regulators to come in and figure out, how to make the rules fair, and then kind of expanded to more broad stream, mainstream retail. Cryptocurrency and kind of blockchain technology was kind of inverted of that. It started retail first on exchange, and is kind of now, everyone's been saying this since 2013. This is the year of institutional adoption, and now we're in a place where we're actually seeing the institutional adoption of the technology. And that's a good thing, because that is actually going to drive more mainstream adoption, because you want the institutions that are custodying, money, that are transmitting money, to be licensed, to be, following the rules, and to be making sure that there's, a secure, safe environment for a more mainstream kind of consumer type company. I mean, custody companies like Anchorage, which Spring invested in. We think they're doing a great job to allow, other institutions to be able to custody funds for users in a safe and secure way. Back in 2013, 2014, those didn't exist. Custodying Bitcoin, custodying XRP was really, really hard. So I don't think the technology was ready for mainstream adoption. And now we're starting to see, those professionals come in with great products and helping to kind of like bolster more mainstream adoption.
I always tell people that, and obviously our teams work together on a little bit. We talk, but I've had a group of developers for a long time, so I've seen blockchain projects get built, and I'm always shocked. Like, man, like this is not easy, right? I think it really ever dawned on people, like it wasn't going to happen overnight, right? It took a little time to kind of build out this feature. It's not a simple there's a reason why you can't have distributed databases and they're all validated in a millisecond, right? It needed time to breathe, I think. And I think it's one thing that people didn't necessarily understand, right? Where there are a lot of people looking at it from an investment perspective or tokens, right? But they're not really doing the heavy lifting, and it's easy to criticize people from the outside. So I totally get that part.
Yeah,
so,
you
hey,
definitely need more like abstraction layers, in any kind of complex technology, and those take time to build.
yeah, wait, it wasn't supposed to be done yesterday? I thought we were supposed to be done last week. Where is
Right.
it? I thought
Yeah.
someone told me it was going to be delivered. Anyways, again, everybody listening, to all the students out there, I think you definitely need to check out Spring, not Xspring. Warren Paul Anderson here. This guy's been in it for a while, and I think you would be probably well served to listen to some of his opinions. And the last thing that I want to ask you, Warren, and just for the students listening, again, if you're 20 years old going to school today, and I'll tell you a story. One reason I love like the Education Alliance, I deal with people, whatever, they're in the crypto space, right? Like could be in a room with a bunch of 30-year-olds and they've been through the ICO world and maybe they've invested in companies that failed. There's a lot of pessimism, right? And why like just, we've given away a decent amount of money or helped college students quite a bit. When I get on a call with 30 students, I don't hear this pessimism. They're like, I'm going to build an application and I'm going to build it with blockchain. So it's like, I see what's coming around the corner. So like to those students, like what would you tell them? Like, obviously you've been in it for a while, but they're thinking about their careers. They're thinking about the courses they want to study. They're debating a job between Apple, Google, Facebook, Amazon, or maybe a crypto company. What would your advice to them be?
Yeah, so we host global hackathons all the time, and I love working with students. I would say, my advice is it's not too late to start now. I think you guys are in a place in a period in time where things are changing rapidly, and you actually have the tools to be a catalyst for those changes. So, I graduated college in 2007, and a year later, the financial market just collapsed. We're kind of in a period of time, right now where that's happening. But, the one difference is now we have this technology, this blockchain technology, that we can actually, use to kind of put the pieces back together in a better way, that to ensure that, these financial collapses don't happen every, 7 to 10 years. So I think, it's exciting time. If you have an inkling to build, just get started. You don't need permission. Whether it's Bitcoin, Ethereum, XRP Ledger, Interledger, you don't need permission to get started. All you need is a laptop or a phone, and just start writing code and building applications. It's a lot of fun. It'll take you places that you never would think or dream or imagine that you would go. and it's global. So you're going to meet friends and build a network all over the world, which is really invaluable.
I couldn't agree more. So kids, listen to Warren. I think Warren has some good experience. Warren, it's been a pleasure to talk with you, and I wish we had more time. I'm hopping off to another interview. We're gonna go 72 hours live here for this conference. So definitely appreciate your time and appreciate your guys' support, whether it's with the Education Alliance and what we're doing here. So yeah, again, appreciate your time, and any last words, say them now.
Definitely. Thanks a lot. Appreciate what you guys are doing with the Education Alliance. We're really happy to be a part of it.
Awesome. All right, everybody. That's it for this episode, and we'll talk to you guys later.
You're tuned in to Reimagine 2020. Stay tuned to learn more about the state-of-the-art in blockchain education and technological development all around the world. Reimagine 2020.